Um, Welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you in person and especially everyone on Zoom. We have friends and colleagues joining from a few different countries. So I want to give a special welcome to those of you outside the United States who are joining us today. I promise not all of us are crazy. Before we begin, I want to give a special thank you to Natalie Greco of the Thai Center and to our wonderful students with the SMU Technology Law Review. Please give yourselves a hand. And I want to single out for praise, special praise, Ruan Maintjes and Sasha Mohammed, who've spent an extraordinary amount of time helping to plan this. I started talking to them back in June or July about organizing a symposium, and they deserve a lot of credit for making this happen. So this has been an area of law near and dear to my heart for almost 20 years now. And I remember working as an associate back in Washington, DC, counseling clients that were using computer hardware and software in operating rooms and in physician offices and hospitals on whether FDA regulated their products, and if so, what types of requirements would apply to those products as medical devices. And it was fascinating stuff to me back then, almost 20 years ago, and today it's even more so, given all of our capabilities today. What we're seeing in hospitals and in operating rooms and on mobile devices is almost the stuff of science fiction. It's stuff that people have been thinking about in science fiction terms since back in the 60s. You guys might remember old Star Trek episodes where they used a tricorder, which was this all-in-one diagnostic device that could instantaneously diagnose any illness or ailment on the spot. And so these kinds of science fiction ideas have been floating around in medicine for decades, but now it's not really science fiction, it's happening. In fact, one of our panelists later today, Nicholson Price in Michigan, teaches a course on science fiction and the law where he contemplates some of this stuff. So it's really exciting. Again, I've been curious about how the federal government regulates computer hardware and software in medicine for a long time. And it's interesting to see what's happening today. And the technologies are very real and they're cutting edge and they're exciting and they're being used. This isn't just the stuff of laboratory testing and ideation. We're actually using these things to treat patients, to diagnose patients, to drive clinical decision-making. And we still have some of the same questions that we've been debating since the 70s and 80s. How does the law handle these technologies? How does medical practice incorporate these things? If you have technologies capable of dramatically revolutionizing the practice of medicine or the doctor-patient relationship, can the law accommodate that? How do hospitals and medical practitioners accommodate that? Are our legal and ethical frameworks up to the task? And to what extent do they have to adapt? So we're going to talk today about how laws and ethical frameworks are adapting to these new technologies, but it's not just a one-way street. I don't want to pretend like it's the job of law and ethics to adapt to these technologies. It's also our job to ensure that these technologies operate within a legal and ethical framework that we've established over many decades to make sure patients are protected, to make sure that risks and benefits are carefully weighed and evaluated. And so this is more than about just how do we change the law to accommodate these technologies. This is about how do we shape these technologies? How do we design them in a way to maximize their benefits and to account for some of the novel risks that they pose? So this is going to be our project today. And like I've said in describing this conference, I want to go beyond navel gazing here. We're not just going to sit around and talk about how novel all of these technologies are. They are being used, they're being implemented. And so I'm calling this kind of a 2.0 conference, because we're not just going to talk about the novelty of these technologies. We're going to talk about how they are operating in practice, and how the law either helps or creates a burden on these technologies. I'm really excited about our panelists today and our panels. We are going a little bit chronologically. We're going to begin in panel 1 by talking about how to design and develop artificial intelligence programs. In panel 2, we're going to talk about how they are implemented in clinical settings. And in panel 3, we're going to talk about how the law treats these technologies and some of the legal challenges we're dealing with right now. So again, this is not just about speculating about what's going to happen in the future. The future is now. And we have some of the country's best experts, and I would dare say some of the world's experts on these issues joining us today. So with that, I am happy to hand the reins over to Sam Ettari to begin panel 1. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cortez. It's my honor to moderate panel 1. And I'd like to introduce the panelists. As Professor Cortez said, we are really blessed today to have some outstanding academics and practitioners and inventors in the field to walk us through pain points, where the law is supportive, where the law can be developed in developing medical devices and software and technology for the healthcare field. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Uzma Samadani. She's the founder of Oculogica and an associate professor at the University of Minnesota. Then I'd like to introduce Dr. Rosina Samadani, who is the president and CEO of Oculogica. And we're going to be hearing a lot about their company, Oculogica, today. Quick preview just to set the stage. Oculogica has developed an FDA-cleared device to aid in diagnosing concussions using artificial intelligence to provide immediate and baseline-free test results. Today, Dr. Samadani will discuss iBox, their patented technology that uses ocular motility and other domains of brain function to help clinicians determine the presence of concussions. We're also joined by Dr. Vishal Ahuja. Dr. Vishal Ahuja is an assistant professor of operations management at the SMU Cox School of Business and an adjunct assistant professor of internal medicine at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. Vishal's research focuses on developing data-driven decision analytic tools with an emphasis on chronic diseases, diabetes in particular, that can be implemented easily by health. Professor Cortez, I think you need to mute. Thank you. Implemented easily by healthcare professionals and policymakers with the ultimate goal of improving patient health and enhancing the quality and efficiency of care delivery. And we'll be hearing a lot about Professor Ahuja's work with startups in this space throughout our panel today. And finally, we're joined by my colleague, Dominique Shelton Leipzig, who is a partner at Perkins Coie, where I'm a senior counsel in the ComLit privacy group. Dominique is the chair and co-chair of a number of practices in the group, including the ad tech practice. She's known for asking deep questions that provoke transformative answers. And as the chair of Perkins' Global Data Innovation Team and co-chair of the ad tech privacy and data management practice, she focuses on privacy, data strategy, leveraging data, and avoiding litigation, which she knows a lot about because she was a litigator for 22 years. She's been counseling for another 9. Okay, so with that introduction and Dominique's expertise will also be on display in a number of ways as we walk through the questions. I'm going to move forward with our panel. So first I'd like to ask Dr. Uzma Samadani to kick us off, and we have slides to help walk us through at a high level to sort of set the stage on what is AI, what is machine learning, and what are some of the uses that you've seen of those technologies in medical devices and the healthcare industries. I think it would be helpful for us to just have a baseline, although I know many are familiar. And as Dr. Cortez said, we're in 2.0, but just to set the stage and so that we all have a common vernacular for the day.
Thank you so much, Samantha, for inviting me, and I'm delighted to kick this off. So, I'm a neurosurgeon and I'm an associate professor of bioinformatics and computational biology. And when I look back on where this all came from, I think it's fascinating. I think we are approaching science fiction. When someone can look at a TV set or a viewing monitor and we can tell what's wrong with their brain, that's pretty amazing. So let's start with basic definitions. So essentially, the way we did science up until machine learning came along was what we call hypothesis driven. And what that means is that we understand a little bit, we make some guesses about what's going to happen, and then we test those guesses with conventional science. And we do regular statistics, p-values, r-squared, goodness of fit, and we test our hypothesis, and then we determine whether or not it's true. And this has been amazing for science. We've figured out things like the fact that insulin is the lack of insulin is the underlying cause of diabetes. We figured out many medical disorders using this method, and there's nothing wrong with this method. But what happens next when disorders get more complicated? Things like headache, things like chronic effects of neurotrauma, things like dementia. When diseases get more complicated and it's not just one problem or a small series of understandable problems, and it becomes problems where there are components to it that we don't understand, genetics, environment, connections, then things get more complicated. And for that, we need something like machine learning. So with machine learning, we don't necessarily have to have a model. We don't necessarily have to have a baseline understanding of how A causes B. What we do have is some sort of complex explanation of the data where some of the variables are neither predictable nor understood, and we don't need to understand them. And then we can use the math to sort of mimic what we call neural networks, which is how a brain thinks, to test our models that we develop on an independent data set. So, if you develop a model on 500 patients, you test it on another 500 patients. So instead of a hypothesis and then test, it becomes model and then test. And then we can take it one step further. Artificial intelligence is what is defined as the capability of a machine to mimic human intelligence. But what it is when machine learning starts to train itself. And things get even, sort of more technical when you get to that point. Next slide, please. So the classic example would, of course, be self-driving cars. So with something like brain injury, this is a really complicated problem, because with something like brain injury, we have the brain injury that we see, right, on imaging. So that's the yellow circle in this Venn diagram. We have the brain injury that we think is happening, and that's loss of consciousness. And then we have the elephant in the room, which is physiologic brain injury. And not only do we not know all of the different pathophysiologies, but we don't even know, there are unknown unknowns. So we have problems here that we don't even know exist. We understand some components of brain injury, but we clearly don't understand all components of brain injury. So this is a perfect scenario where something like machine learning might be helpful. So next slide. This is an example from my lab, where basically we looked at values for serum markers in a population of patients who progressed to brain death, or who only had brain injury, or who were controls. And what we find is the relationships are not linear. So when you have these types of relationships, something like machine learning can help you differentiate between subsets of patients and potentially prognosticate. And so the reason I bring up this example is you get out of machine learning what you put into it. Here, all we put in was serum marker values, but imagine that you put in more. You could put in, for example, radiographic, like algorithmic measures of CT scan or imaging. You could put in, for example, socioeconomic factors, but you have to be careful what you put in, because that will impact what you put out. So you could make the model better and more accurate at predicting, but if it's including things, for example, like socioeconomic status, we know that people who are raised in poverty or who have a different color of skin are twice as likely to die after a brain injury. And so we bake in inequity into our machine learning algorithms. Next slide. So what makes the machine learning such a powerful tool for brain injury. It's the fact that we don't understand all the pathways. So we understand some of the pathways, and in theory, we could do hypothesis-based science with our basic understanding. But when we build models here, it's nice to be able to build models without having a complete understanding of every single pathway and how it works. And so essentially with Oculogica, what we did was we started with machine learning, and now we are moving into the AI phase. Next slide. Ultimately, the hope is that we build algorithms. We combine multiple data sets. We combine things like molecular markers of injury, conventional radiographic measures of injury, eye tracking, potentially even genetics, and we build algorithms that help us classify the nature of a very complex problem so that we can treat it. Next slide. And ultimately, this should be just like face recognition software in the grocery store. So when someone walks into the hospital or just looks at their computer at home using telehealth, we should be able to understand what's wrong with them. Are they brain injured? Are they intoxicated? What exactly is the nature of their problem and how do we fix it? So I hope that that helps with defining the basic principles of machine learning and AI. And I will turn it over to the next speakers in the panel.
Great, thank you so much, Uzma. So Ruan, if you wouldn't mind advancing to the next slide, we're gonna try to show a quick little clip on Oculogica's iBox to set the stage for the next question and conversation with Dr. Rosina. So fingers crossed it plays, otherwise we will we'll roll right into the questions.
This is the Oculogica.
Oh, Ruan, take yourself off mute. It's the only way we can hear the audio of the video.
In under 4 minutes, the iBox tracks thousands of small eye movements while the patient watches a short video. The height adjustable forehead rest accommodates both pediatric and adult patients. The collected data is then analyzed and used to generate an objective assessment of concussion and other abnormal brain conditions.
Fantastic. Okay, so Ruan, while you cue back up to the slides, we'll just jump into this. So Dr. Rosina, can you explain how the iBox has changed the diagnosis of brain injuries in this space, and do a little more of a deep dive? I know Dr. Uzma has already kind of set us up by showing some of the data from the lab, but can you talk about how machine learning has been incorporated in the diagnostic tool, and how, phase 2, as Dr. Uzma alluded to, where is the tool going with AI? How do you expect to incorporate that into the tool?
So thank you so much, Samantha, and so nice to meet everybody. I'm so sorry we're not there in person. It would be a completely different experience, be a lot smoother. I know this has been really challenging for everybody. So where concussion is in sort of like a diagnostic phase right now is that we're really at an inflection point. We're moving from a subjective world to an objective world, and that's for the better. What I mean by subjective is that concussion in the sort of dark ages that I'll call it has been diagnosed with basically a very subjective symptom checklist and some neurocognitive exams, which are highly dependent on patient input and potentially socioeconomic background, academic background, cognitive capabilities. all sorts of things that actually should not be a part of a diagnosis of actual brain injury. We are moving to, thankfully, an era where we will have an objective diagnostic for brain injury. Our technology will be one of those. It'll be a multimodal assessment. Eye tracking will be the basis for at least one of those objective assessments. So that's sort of just gives a little bit of context about where we are with concussion diagnosis in the field in general. From iBox's perspective, the way that the technology works is that it's completely based on how your brain is functioning, how cranial nerves are functioning, and the implications for their function on actual eye movements. And we are not looking at volitional eye movements. We are looking at the measurement of how well the eyes are able to move together and in other capacities. And because we take the volitional part out of it, that removes the subjectivity and moves this into an objective world, which really changes the game for concussion patients completely. Because all of a sudden you've got a way to assess them that is not based on their will or their capabilities from an academic standpoint, or their subjective assessment of their level of fatigue, for example, or how if they're feeling slow, or if they're feeling in a fog, which are actual real questions in a concussion assessment. So that gives you a little bit of a sense for how iBox is really leading the charge into a new era for concussion diagnosis.
And Dr. Rosina and also Dr. Uzma, we just got a question in, which I think dovetails nicely. Priya Dave asked, I'm curious about your opinion regarding whether this could replace a radiologist or allow for other specialists to read their own studies. Why or why not? And I would layer on, do you see a point in time where the actual patient could engage with this tool and just get a readout that is, layman's language, go, get treated for a concussion, or no, you're fine, go lay down
Yeah.
till you feel better.
Yeah, on the radiological findings, I'll let Uzma address that, because what CT is looking for is actually something that's quite different than a concussion. Uzma, do you want to just explain the difference between structural brain injury and what a concussion is?
So I think the main thing is like, what happened to that comedian in Orlando, for example, Bob Saget. He probably fell in his hotel room and he hit his head. And, his big question was, can I just get in my hotel bed and go to sleep, or do I need to go to the ER? And he did some math in his head and decided he didn't need to go to the ER, most likely. Why didn't he go to the ER? It's a pain, it's a hassle. You don't want to, go sit and wait somewhere. He's in a different city. He didn't have anyone with him. When someone gets hit in the head, they're basically, there's one question that they want the answer to is, am I going to die from this, or am I going to be okay? And that's the first big question. You can answer that question with a physiologic functional test like eye tracking, because it will immediately tell you that, hey, there's something wrong. You can also answer it with a CT scan, which gives you completely different information. It tells you radiographically what the brain looks like. So eye tracking tells you how the brain feels, and imaging tells you what the brain looks like. We are not FDA cleared. Eye tracking is not yet FDA cleared for that particular indication. We are working on that. But they give you completely different information. So I hope that answers the first question. I think that it depends on the context. For someone who has a concussion, who's they're not necessarily concerned that it's a life-threatening injury, but they may not be able to function at their job. They may have a disability that precludes them from participating in, social activities or sports. Eye tracking can be very helpful there, because it'll answer an objective question as to whether or not the brain is functioning normally. And, it's basically, it's not really yes, no, it's more of how abnormally. So that is a question that can be answered with this technology.
Yeah, so hopefully that answers the first question. And then on the second question, with respect to a consumer handheld app, that is certainly a direction that we are going towards eventually. I think that for concussion in particular, we are still of the opinion that a medical professional needs to be involved in that diagnosis because the implications are so major. It's your brain. It's not, it's not a fingernail.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Thank you. And thank you for the questions. So we now have the background on Oculogica, which is going to set the stage going forward. And now I'd like to turn it over to Professor Ahuja, who, as I said at the outset, has done a lot of work with startups and developers to bring software to the marketplace in the healthcare space that utilizes AI and machine learning, or ML. And so I'd ask Professor Ahuja, who also has a series of really helpful slides, to walk us through how this space is evolving, sort of talk us through kind of the capital that is going into this space, what factors are contributing to the trends in this space, and just general observations you're seeing on the growth of product types in healthcare that incorporate or utilize AI and ML.
Thank you, Sam. Of course, a great introduction to AI and ML in general. And of course, we got to learn about the product. So let me, before I dig into where the money is flowing, let me talk about what is the difference between AI and digital health, in case it's not clear. So digital health really is a broad term, that encompasses mobile health, HIT, wearable devices, and you have it. And I really like this definition from this company called Digital Authority Partners, where the author says AI and digital health were made for each other. Digital health looks for digital solutions to promote the health of the body and the mind, and AI attempts to reproduce feats of mind in digital form. And in simple terms, digital health is the matter, AI, the mind. As I said, to understand what's happening, the future is here, but we want to know what the future might look like. Follow the money. And so here what I'm showing you, and this graph comes from Rock Health, which is a full service seed fund that supports startups in all sorts of digital health applications, including funding and access to medical venture, legal and compliance process. You can see the past 10 years, there's been a steady increase in venture funding, both the dollar terms and the number of deals. Especially the past 2 years, especially one last year, it is effectively doubled to today at $30 billion. Now, what's so special about the last 2 years? If you have not been unconscious, you know what hit the past 2 years. That's the pandemic. And 2020 was the first year, sort of the 3/4 of year, if you will, and the investors and the entrepreneurs like Dr. Rosina and Uzma were thinking about maybe, you guys may have started a lot long ago, but a lot of entrepreneurs thought, but now that we have this pandemic and people can't come see their doctors, what else can we do? And the funding really skyrocketed the last year. And looking at, the slide really shows where the money is flowing, what aspects of development and areas. And I want you to pay attention to the right-hand side, which is the clinical indications. Look at the number one spot, mental health, 900% increase within the past 5 years. And why so? Because several reasons. One, mental health, of course, within the pandemic, or as the pandemic came across, the mental health, which was already bad in the United States, actually grew worse. There have been several reports out there. And I was speaking to the head of mental health within the Texas VA, or the region that controls the Texas VA. And he said, oh, thank goodness for this telemedicine, because now patients who wouldn't otherwise come see, let's say for the therapy to a psychologist, because of many barriers like logistical and stigma, perhaps. Again, this is the Veterans Affairs, where I'm also an academic affiliate. And he said now we see this continuity, which is critical for improving mental health outcomes. Number 2 is diabetes, another 5 times growth. I spent a lot of time thinking about diabetes, on how to improve care using non-clinical ways. And I highlight these two because, one, diabetes is the most expensive chronic condition in the United States at $327 billion. But CDC says that people who suffer from chronic conditions like diabetes and mental health consume 90% of the nation's almost $4 trillion expenditures. I want to kind of think about the money involved here. And just to kind of show you, the first sort of chart was more general digital health, but this is healthcare AI funding, and that has followed the same pattern as well. So the interest in AI is definitely there. Again, looking at the potential for growth, today, the AI in healthcare market stands at about $7 billion. Within the next 6 years, it's projected to grow tenfold to almost $70 billion. So that's kind of gives you a sense of where we are. And one area that has seen remarkable growth, especially the past year, is direct to consumer applications. Now, this is a potential for growth, but also potential for involvement of regulatory and legal issues. So I saw one estimate that put the number of health apps to be about 318,000, with 200 health apps added daily. How many of them are regulated? Probably very few, and that's at least from what I hear. And it's hard to regulate so many apps, and how does FDA do it? And perhaps use machine learning to regulate machine learning apps, or things like NLP, natural language processing. Just give you a sense of where we are. And these are some of the trends from about 2 years ago, but that's before pandemic, but things are pretty much the same here. I want to kind of pointed out some examples of what's happening. And the biggest driving factor is, one, patients really want on-demand healthcare, whether it be their wearable devices or their mobile health apps, and especially because 52% of web browsing worldwide happens on mobile phones. Consumers like to do research before they visit a doctor or a hospital. They want wearable devices like those traditional Fitbits, but also glucose monitors, heart rate sensors, oximeters. Many of them are perhaps not regulated. And as the data becomes available in the form of EHRs, for example, so big companies like Cerner and Epic and whatnot, people are looking for insights into using big data. Like, for example, can we reduce medication errors? And of course, at the end of the day, AI, really, the idea is, can we lower the cost? Can we increase the convenience and increase satisfaction? That's becoming important. So I want to give you some examples of where some of the AI applications are happening. And I'm going to sort of give you examples from where either I have worked on in research, or I've interacted with companies like startups. So the one area is disease screening. Think about breast cancer screening. The area I have worked on is, how do you pick out a patient who may or may not have diabetes and recommend them to go get, and let's say a glucose test, like A1C test. You know, even the cost of test is low, but to manage it can be expensive. And so we proposed an algorithm, which has been copyrighted by UT Southwestern, that uses machine learning, optimization, and reinforcement learning to predict which patient is likely to develop diabetes. And breast cancer screening and generally cancer care, I've seen a lot of research in that direction. The other big area is pharmacovigilance, which is understanding the drug profile, its safety and potentially adverse events once the drug is approved by the FDA. So I was at this, I was invited as an expert panelist in an FDA workshop a few years ago, where I've done some work also. We're thinking about the traditional way of, and I think Uzma mentioned that early on. The traditional way is like, look at the adverse event reporting system and kind of try to see what drug may have what profile and maybe issue recalls or warnings accordingly. Scott Gottlieb, a few years ago, who's a former FDA commissioner, said, well, you know, it's not enough anymore, given the large availability of data. He basically said it's imperative that FDA relies or analyze large quantities of data related to the safety and effectiveness of medical products and turn these signals into information that can be used by both patients and providers to make informed decisions. So not just rely on adverse event reporting, but see how we can use artificial intelligence, machine learning, that is data driven, to separate signal from noise and make effective decisions. The third area is clinical trial design, given that half the patent life is spent into sort of developing the drug. And there are several aspects of clinical trial designs. This intelligent clinical trials is a Deloitte report, but the area I have focused on is how can we rethink about the design? Instead of focusing on the standard randomized controlled trial where you separate people into two arms, treatment and say placebo, can we rethink that? Can we learn, which is the machine learning side, from patients' earlier responses and start allocating them to different arms and shorten the trial, or at least improve the outcomes? So again, that's reinforcement learning driven. Care coordination is another area where people are using machine learning to improve the continuity, the planning of patient care. Well, I haven't worked with Viz.ai, which is one of the leaders. I worked with two other companies that are listed here, Care Continuity and Care Align. Care Continuity is actually out of Dallas and Care Align out of Penn Medicine. And they are not using AI, but just to give you a sense, my several conversations, they are going to use AI, if not today, tomorrow. And then finally, I'm going to talk the remote patient monitoring. That really has gained steam since pandemic hit, because patients can come for their regular appointments, their labs, their biopsies, and so forth. And so to track their vitals to begin with is becoming important. So all sorts of remote patient monitoring. And the company I work with was Stream Vitals, that is looking at how, especially now that the reimbursements are available from Medicare, can they better improve and better sort of do preventative care, if you will, but not after the patient's been admitted. And there are many, many more. And one of the things that I want to sort of reinforce what both Rosina and Uzma said was the general idea, of course, I'm not saying that's every other app out there, is to augment or aid the clinical decision-making, not replace it, just to make it better in some sense. And this really headline, I like this because COVID really opened the floodgates for machine learning. Again, the rise of telemedicine, precision medicine, and the rising labor and capital costs. But we should be mindful of, some of the issues that are popping around. Trust is a big one, especially from consumers who still worry about their privacy. And providers are always cautious because they get, always worry about getting replaced and whatnot. But the question I have is, would convenience trump those concerns? Because we still use our phones and we still, let's say, accept all the cookies and we just, go ahead. So I don't know the answer to that, but we definitely need expertise from legal experts and regulatory experts, which I'm not a legal expert, but definitely we need something around. And I'll end with some challenges and areas of focus. Again, I mentioned about direct-to-consumer sales. We're also moving from a world of fee-for-service to value-based care. And this is one of my favorites, health inequity, which pandemic's shown a big, bright light on, things like social determinants of health, algorithmic bias. And if I were to project what's going to come the next 10 years, interoperability, which is, can a patient carry the electronic health record from place to place, whether it's a PCP, a lab, a specialist, all sorts of things. And the future, I don't know what it looks like, but there's been work going on, would insurers and hospitals be willing to part with their, confidential information? I don't know the answer, but we definitely need some legal and regulatory frameworks to think about. So with that, I'll end. Hopefully it gives you some sense of where the market is evolving.
Incredible. Thank you, Dr. Ahuja. So first, Ruwan, if you wouldn't mind taking the deck down, because we're not going to need it for a little bit now, and then we can see our panelists and some of our participants today. So, just a perfect setup, Dr. Ahuja. We've, now traced the need, the demand, the growth. We've talked about the technology, and you said at the end, consumers worry about their privacy. Will convenience trump privacy? So you said we need the legal experts, and I bring you the legal experts. So Dominique, As you know, with your many years working in privacy and with AI, machine learning, can you talk about now kind of that legal landscape? What laws, both domestically, internationally, are regulating this space? Where are the, the challenges being presented by the regulations, or even the lack of regulation as this space just barrels forward and funding is doubling? Are the regulations, are the laws keeping a pace? So I turn it over to you to give us that privacy context now.
Well, great. And, Sam, you also are a privacy law expert, so I'm hoping this will be a dialogue. So what we've got going on is with this heightened dependence on data. And I was just thinking about what Professor Ahuja was talking about in terms of the funding of these health startups. And we're seeing that heightened reliance on data during the pandemic in all aspects in order for us to conduct business, go to school, attend work, and et cetera. So we have this heightened dependence on data. We're generating now globally 2.5 quintillion bytes of data. And so for those of you who are not mathematicians, I know not on our panel, you guys are all experts, but it's 18 zeros that we're talking about of data that's being generated, 2.5 quintillion bytes of data per day. And all of that data can be used in some sense when we're talking about predictive analytics and so forth and development of algorithms. So much can be generated that is now really where the law is sort of catching up. So in the US, we have HIPAA, and that covers medical health information, and that is information that is individually identifiable to a person, and it has to be generated by either a covered entity or a business associate. So where does that leave wearables? Where does that leave mobile apps and so much data that is being generated in some of these other vehicles? Well, currently, unless this is prepared by a covered entity, a doctor, a hospital, and not the patient alone, or unless it is a business associate that is a service provider hired by a covered entity to assist, then that is not covered by HIPAA. So then that's where the state laws start to come in, because in the US, we do not have a federal privacy law. And this is a matter of angst for many consumers and privacy practitioners and businesses alike. Everyone is crying out for a federal privacy law. And there's actually, interestingly enough, bipartisan support, but we don't have movement on it, in part because there are all these other priorities going on with the pandemic and otherwise that are taking priority over the federal privacy law. So in this area, we talked about HIPAA, which is a federal law, but there are gaps. And then we've got state laws in the US, like biometric laws. You have one in Texas. There's a lot of litigation around one in Illinois. And then you have jurisdictions like where I'm talking to you from in California, where we've sort of taken that leap to jump into the areas related to algorithms and biometric information, facial recognition with our California Consumer Privacy Act, which is about to be updated. And on January 1st, 2023, will become the California Privacy Rights Act. And I just want to focus on the fact that data, these 2.5 quintillion bytes of data, are not just generated in the US. This is a global phenomenon. So we really need to look globally, and we do have 150 countries with data protection laws, most of which were enacted after the Europeans put forward their general data protection regulation, which went into effect in May 2018. So we had about a little under 70 countries with data protection laws at the time of GDPR. And now we're up to 150 countries. So they're trying to get at putting some sort of mandating ethics and mandating some parameters around what is disclosed to consumers and what businesses can do with this data and sensitive data like health.
Dominique, do you see businesses, I'm gonna ask you like a very general question, but do you generally see businesses sort of setting their mark to the California, the CCPA, CPRA standard in the US because they're either national or they just anticipate that their state is going to come along soon with something similar?
Yes, I think there's a recognition that data and privacy and data security are now locked into brand value and trust. And it is so critical that companies now treat their data like the principal asset that it is. And these disastrous data breaches, ransomware attacks on hospitals and other things are very damaging to the brand. And so there is a realization that even if we're not required to do it, that companies are looking to map themselves to a standard primarily for that brand value trust issue that is becoming so critical. And I will also say business is also moving in a direction that is actually leapfrogging in front of legislation. So we have certain platforms like mobile app platforms for applications requiring opt-in consent for tracking and gathering of data, behavioral data through apps. And that's just before you can even download the app. So that those things have changed and are changing the landscape significantly, where it's moving billions of dollars of business and changing and shifting the way that data is gathered and used.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dominique, for giving us that privacy context, because now we're really sort of going to shift into that with a deeper conversation around this. And Ruan, could you throw the deck back up, because we have a slide, if you can advance to slide 23. Dr. Uzma, we've alluded to this concept of bias in the use of AI, and we've talked about ensuring fairness. And I think part of what Dominique was sharing is this concept of trust in the data, and that's not just security trust, right? That's that trust that the data is going to be used appropriately, but also that the outputs are going to be reliable. And that's all part of that trust paradigm that patients and practitioners bring to using the technologies that we're talking about today. And so to set the stage for a kind of a little bit of a deeper dive on the privacy issues and where the regs are going around this concept of algorithmic fairness and addressing bias in AI and machine learning, could you bring us, ground us in some examples of how that kind of bias can present in these data sets, whether it's intentional or more likely maybe unknowingly manifesting, and how do you spot it and weed it out? So we've got the slide up. Great.
Well, thank you for asking me to talk about this, because I think it's something that is incredibly important as AI takes over healthcare. And this is a picture of basically a chromosome with telomeres. And essentially the reason that I put this in here is that telomere length is now known to correlate. There's an association between extended telomeres and life expectancy. And we also know what types of things impact telomere length. So things like stress and poverty and living in a violent area and lack of sleep and sort of hunger. Not caloric deprivation is actually good for you, but actual hunger and starvation is not good for you. So all of these factors impact your telomere length. And, just yesterday, a colleague of mine was presenting at a conference in Las Vegas on spine, and they presented a paper that used AI to predict outcomes in spine surgery. And they showed that people who were in poverty had worse outcomes. And, obviously no one's surprised about that. But, if you build algorithms, like suppose an insurance company says, well, we're only going to pay for spine surgery if it has a good outcome, right? And then your algorithm has baked into it sort of telomere length type stuff. then you're going to have a problem, because the patients who might need spine surgery aren't necessarily going to get it because they grow up in poverty, right? So I had a classic example. I recently did a surgery on a guy who came in basically came to my clinic on Friday morning, and he had been found to have a spinal cord tumor, literally in tears because he didn't want to take time off from work. He worked as a maintenance person at a hotel. He had no health insurance. He was a consultant. What are you going to do with someone like that? They're going to have a quote unquote poor outcome because they live in poverty. They don't have health insurance. Ended up doing the surgery and he went back to work. But the issue is if we build algorithms that screen out those patients, we're not going to serve our population well. And so it's very important that when AI algorithms get created, that they incorporate measures that are truly objective. And we have to be very careful because we know that many medical devices are not as objective as we think. So for example, pulse oximetry. The COVID pandemic has taught us that pulse oximetry is not as accurate in pigmented skins. So this is a huge problem. I'll let the other panelists speak on this because I know other people have, significantly greater insights into this than I do. But I just want to say that, ultimately AI is only as good as what we put into it. And we have to be very careful with what goes in.
Oh, that's excellent. That's such a great stage to set for my question now to Dominique, which is, how are regulators, how is the law attempting to address this, right? What kind of guidance are they giving to the engineers or through the lawyers to the engineers to help them identify these issues and address them? So what are we seeing as far as guidance from outside, from regulators?
Yeah, so algorithmic fairness and the avoiding bias in algorithms has become a big issue globally and an area of concern, particularly in the area of health. And so what we're starting to see are a couple of things. I'll just give you a couple of things that are being raised. In the context of privacy, so much of what is being discussed globally relates to consumer or individual protection, consumer protection, basically. And that's based on unfairness to avoid unfair outcomes and to avoid deceptive outcomes. So in the US, for example, our Federal Trade Commission has Section 5 of the FTC Act, which is there to enforce against deceptive or unfair practices. And so there's been talk from our FTC Commissioner, Lena Khan, as well as from privacy folks, such as some of our clients. I was recently at a panel and hearing one of our clients from Microsoft speak about this, but the thought being that the fairness component already bakes in a requirement to ensure to avoid unfair outcomes. So that is one sort of school of thought that is developing. The other school of thought is coming out of the EU, still on the fairness concept, that the privacy impact assessments that are required under the General Data Protection Regulation, that those impact assessments should incorporate a discussion about fairness and some sort of fairness evaluation as it relates to the collection of personal information and the processing of personal information. And that is a school of thought that some data protection authorities in the EU are talking about right now. We also have actual cases and settlements here in the US where litigation has occurred about unfair outcomes associated with the processing of data. And so that is an area as well. I also want to point out, just about 10 days ago, Senator Booker just introduced a bill relating to algorithmic fairness, and that is an issue, a bill that should be watched. And there are several other sort of proposals in Congress right now around the federal privacy law. Senator Wicker has one, Senator Cantwell, and those bills do incorporate a sort of a shout out to discrimination laws and pointing out that discriminatory outcomes should not occur with data. So look out for that area. It is an area where there is bipartisan support in the House and Senate, the House bipartisan Democrat and Republican bill on privacy, or proposed federal privacy bill in 2019. There was agreement there on the processing of data not to cause civil rights issues. And then I want to say one other thing. Look at the Data and Trust Alliance. There have been some articles about it in the New York Times. The former CEO of American Express, Ken Chenault, started the Data and Trust Alliance, and companies like Walmart and others in the health area are part of this. And it is to avoid algorithmic bias in connection with hiring, but you can see these concepts extending elsewhere. So stay tuned for more on the law soon.
It's so fascinating to just layer on all of the commentary on this, because it becomes very clear that the onus is not on, you know, one piece or one participant of the process here. It's everywhere. It's with the engineers, it's with the privacy specialists, it's coming from the regulators, it's coming from the legislatures, it's coming from business. I love that you brought up the Data Trust Alliance. I mean, it's again coming back to this concept of good stewardship and businesses driving this forward as well. So it's just a great kind of takeaway that this is a kind of a global initiative to ensure that we are approaching AI in an ethical manner. I want to acknowledge there is a question in the chat about how the FDA is approaching these tools, and it's a complex question that I'm going to hold because we have a speaker from the FDA and we have a panel focused more closely on regulators. Just want to move forward with our kind of now pulling this back, or maybe it's pulling it in, where our whole discussion this morning is on development of these products and all the factors that go into that development. And I want to pause to talk about privacy by design, right? So part of that is the algorithmic fairness and the ethical considerations. But what else? And I'm going to kind of toss this to Dr. Samadani and Professor Ahuja, and also Dominique, just kind of open the floor to, and Dominique, maybe you can kick us off with just the kind of like concept of privacy by design as a concept. And then it would be great to hear the scientists and practitioners talk about how does that really play out? How do you deliver privacy by design, the message to your engineers? How do you supervise it? How do you make sure privacy is baked into the product from the get-go?
Yeah, you know, it just really requires intentionality and communication and bringing all the stakeholders together. So very important for whoever is leading the privacy function. Well, if you don't have someone in your company that's leading the privacy function, it's important to create that either a team or a person to sort of drive that initiative. We've seen it be effective when the CEO of the company is also brought in. And listen, when the CEO understands that they might be splashed on, if they're successful in their startup, that they might be splashed on the Wall Street Journal, you know, the front page of the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and New York Times, like Clearview and Zoom and others, that is not a place where most CEOs want to be. And so very easy to have that dialogue, get them to do a 1-minute video to say, privacy is important to this company. And from there, we've seen a lot of, you know, ambassadors in the company then raise their hand to be part of the design effort and looking into what can be done to ensure that data, only the amount of data that's necessary and that's mission driven is collected. And so, you know, if you're building an algorithm or looking at certain outcomes, focusing on those data sets rather than sort of, you know, building with everything possible that you can get your hands on that may not even be mission driven. So first figuring out what is it you need to achieve your goals. Then so much of privacy by design involves knowing what you are collecting, knowing where it's stored, and knowing who you're sharing it with. So that can be clearly communicated to the customers, whether they are B2B or B2C, about what you're doing as a company with data. And that's what regulators are looking for. The FTC has a sort of comprehensive privacy program that they often order as part of consent decrees, and a comprehensive data security program, and the notice part, the part of knowing where your data is, and also assessing what you're doing with data and how that benchmarks with the laws that are applicable is a necessary step, so that your mitigation efforts about what security you're taking, what you're encrypting, what you're de-identifying can be targeted to the actual environment. I will say, rather than looking at these compliance measures as a root canal, it's very much an opportunity to look at it as a value add. We're seeing folks from the World Economic Forum, BlackRock, Vanguard, et cetera, very active in this area of privacy and cyber, and actually going around rating companies, literally. Proxy companies like ISS and Glass Lewis actually have ratings on privacy and cyber. So if your startup is not up to snuff, that can reduce your exit strategy possibilities at all, or reduce the price, because so much will have to be done to mitigate. So I would like to see more, education at the private equity and VC level to get the companies in shape so that they are able to be acquired. Because as you and I were talking about, Sam, and you've been part of this, doing the due diligence on behalf of the purchasing companies that say, listen, we've got to know if we are a big company A, B, or C, if we're taking on the startup, we cannot take on huge liability to our brand and value and trust. And so here is our checklist on privacy and cyber that we need. So the exit strategy can very much, as Dr. Ahuja was talking about, for these startups, be hampered by their inability or their lack of attention to privacy by design. And I finally will end. There's a great, on the ops side, a great, we have a podcast called Decrypted Unscripted, and we featured Nishant Vishran, who is a privacy design operations engineer at Uber. And he has some great tips about how to operationalize privacy from a technical standpoint in the environment.
I just love that, because it's a complete focus shift, right? Compliance always has this kind of negative overtone to it. And this is, no, privacy is a value add for so many reasons, even going all the way back to the start of our conversation, which is engaging and engendering and earning the trust of the consumer, which is important. So taking what Dominique just shared, kind of like, and funneling it down, first, I would ask Dr. Samadani, because you're sitting inside a company, how do you take those concepts and impart them to the engineers? Like you mentioned, or Rosina, maybe you mentioned at the beginning that AI is kind of the next phase. So you're in that development phase now.
Yep.
How do you take this and get this to the engineers in a way that's meaningful?
Yeah, so we're a medical device company. We are not a consumer-facing company. We're a medical device company. And as such, we are subject to very strict regulations regarding how we do everything, how we collect data, how we develop a product. In order to submit to FDA for an indication, you need to be compliant with certain regulations. And if you are going to submit outside of the United States, then you need to be compliant with other regulations like ISO 13485 in order to even, make the submission. So as part of that, you have to have a privacy officer, you need to have QA, you need to have an entire set of trainings that everybody goes through that touches data. Uzma often comes to me and says, can we get this into the product? And we can, but everything needs to go through a QA process. And in order to incorporate a new turn on an algorithm, we have to have collected that data in an IRB compliant fashion, which requires that we have either informed consent or we went through a de-identification process and have handled all of our data in a completely appropriate manner, incorporated into the product, and then roll it out that way. It's not a trivial process. And Dr. Ahuja had mentioned that there are consumer digital health companies in there, and there are digital health companies that go through an FDA process. If you are making a diagnosis as an app, and you are stating that somebody has a medical condition, you need to go through an FDA process. FDA may not be regulating and may not be catching all of the consumer apps out there that are diagnosing people with something inappropriately and without an actual label.
but that is what you're supposed to be doing. As a medical device company, we're actually very surprised at the things that we see other medical device companies able to do. And in particular, what consumer facing companies have been able to do with data. We are, I guess, very conservative. And so we, that's just not a very simple, a simple process. On the data front, we have it actually inherent in our product that when the data is exported, you can either do an identified version or a de-identified version. We're very mindful about that. And that de-identified version does strip the 18 elements that are part of the safe harbor for HIPAA, so that we can use that data for the future. If you're going to submit to FDA, you do need to be under IRB. You're going to have to handle the patient consent somehow. And so you're going to have to think that through before you collect that data. You can do it afterwards. Then you have to do a sort of like a mass de-identification and then go through something. But FDA is going to take a look at your clinical trial process and try to understand that.
So pulling it back, switching gears, I suppose, or not, maybe it's just looking at the other side of the coin. From the medical device perspective, what I'm hearing is that there's the fortunate presence of the FDA to drive privacy by design throughout the process. But when you don't have that component, when you have the consumer, you have the consumer facing product that is falling, at the margins of the regulations or completely outside of them. And, I would ask Professor Ahuja to talk about this. How does that message of privacy by design, when it's not forced, right? You don't have a regulator. You're not going to go through an FDA, process of submitting your product and showing your homework. You're just going to take a product to market. How do you get the engineers, the folks who are very focused on finance and making a profitable product as quickly as possible? How do you get that message down to them to incorporate privacy from the get-go?
So great question. And let me sort of add a few things that both Dominique and Rosina really well, very well articulated, their thoughts. One, supporting fully what Dominique said, data is the new oil, is the way I see it. And privacy really stands at the forefront of it. And what Rosina said is a lot of those apps, I would agree with that, although I don't have any proof per se that many should be regulated. And there's always this gray zone. If some it is clear that they have to go through the FDA process, some perhaps are not so clear. So how do we think about it? Let me sort of step back a little bit. So one, the healthcare landscape itself is, or at least the health tech landscape is complex and fragmented to begin with. And as Dominique really, kind of pointed out, the regulations vary by the continent, Europe, North America, Asia. Within the same continent might vary with countries, and even within the United States, for example, California typically is at the forefront, and other states, so it's a state issue typically held. So how do developers, entrepreneurs think about that? And let me step back a little bit in terms of investors who are pouring money into those companies, who are traditionally tech investors, and health tech is a new thing, and privacy compliance really need to be thought about. And often, they are mindful, but sometimes they lack the tools. So for example, NHS, which is the UK government responsible for setting digital, and NHS is, some of you may know, is the National Health Service in the UK, and they come up with this new tool of, these are the guidelines that you need to follow to assess, whether this digital tool meets a certain standard of clinical safety, cybersecurity, data protection, and compared with all others in the market. Now, I would argue I won't be sure that everyone's following, but those investors really need to pay attention and hire firms like yourself to kind of think about, first, does this product need FDA approval? And if so, what do the steps look like? And then it's like a game of chess. You kind of backtrack your moves down to the current one. Okay, before we start, because it's easy to build in privacy when you're building the product, and I would argue elements of algorithmic fairness, rather than make changes later on. So I think this is, I'm not quite sure I fully answer your question, but these are some of the thoughts that kind of, I think about it.
Yeah, I think that goes right to what Dominique was saying and dovetails so nicely about don't wait till the end when you're, trying to take the product to the next level, and you're going to have to look backwards on how to address a lack of privacy, a lack of algorithmic fairness. That's going to be a lot more costly. And as Dominique said, maybe even impact what the value of the company is, because that was not baked in from the outset. So very helpful. I don't know if anyone else wants to add on this point before we move on.
I think Dr. Pakul Patel, it'll be really interesting to hear what he has to say on this, because he's got an enormous task and they can't do everything. They can't even regulate the companies that are being regulated, so that are in the process. So it'll be very interesting to hear what he has to say.
Can I add a couple more things? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I didn't realize.
Oh, I was just going to say, Professor Ahuja, that yes, I think that this is going to be driven a lot by the market, maybe even before regulation catches up. And so when I'm looking at situations like last Saturday, the front cover of the Wall Street Journal and a third of market cap goes down based on privacy. And that's on page number 1. I think that catches attention. And when we're talking about billions of dollars, similarly, when some of these hangups that have been happening in terms of acquisitions and the antitrust privacy concerns that are bubbling around in Europe as well as the US gives moment for pause. So in a sense, it might just be that the dollars that are at issue and that Professor Ahuja was talking about on the slide, the companies that are the potential acquirers of those startups might actually be driving the dialogue more quickly than our regulators are able to catch up.
Yeah, I just want to add a couple of things. One, Dominique, you mentioned Ken Schnall. He is a member of General Catalyst, which is one of the large venture capitalists. And General Catalyst invested in several companies recently, health tech startups as well, one of which was Tiger Connect, which is another care coordination platform that I've talked to them. So not that everyone is just not following them. People are thinking about that, just to kind of give you some sense. And from an algorithmic fairness perspective, I've seen some companies actually thinking about ahead of time. And from a more technical standpoint, things like cross-validation for some of you statistical nerds like me out there, you can do some of that to actually check out whether what you're arguing that this is the outcome or prediction from one subset of population will also apply to the other.
Exactly. I mean, if you have a product that is supposed to be predictive and it doesn't work on people of color, for example, and we're in a situation where the Gen Z population is already majority diverse in the US, that is really not going to play very well market-wise. And these are the things that I think those realities are sort of crashing in the business in the business world to be able to get a head start and try to get in front of these algorithmic fairness and privacy issues ahead of time, because it all goes to the brand and the value and the trust that I know Jill and her panel will be talking about more.
Fantastic. Well, we have a couple questions and we're getting close to time. And I know that our doctors, Samadani, do need to drop hard drops in the next couple minutes. So before we turn, well, I am going to steal a little bit of time from the break for the questions. But before we turn to questions, I would like to go ask each of the panelists to just leave us kind of with their key takeaway to, in this development stage, when grappling with AI and machine learning, whether it's a legal privacy principle or pragmatic, fundraising principle, what would you leave the audience with as kind of a big picture? Do not forget, if you're going forward to develop a medical device or a healthcare app, what should they take away from this panel? What nugget would you would ask them to bear in mind? So I'll start off with you, Dominique.
Yeah, I think the thing to keep in mind is that privacy is not an adjunct. It is actually something that is core to the future of health and AI, and is critical for the development of this sector. So looking at it as these data is sort of the crux of the issue, and there is so much regulatory attention and also consumer attention on this topic because of our overdependence, that it's really important to think of it as a core business issue that is, leaving aside the legal imperatives. It is a matter of market cap, future, and it's really core to the business. So that'd be my takeaway.
Great. Ruan, can you take down the deck? I don't think we need it just for the end. Great. Okay, Dr. Uzma, could you share your takeaway?
Well, I think AI is going to happen, and it's incumbent on the people who are generating the algorithms to make it as fair as possible. When we first developed the eye tracking technology in my lab, I was actually very concerned that, one could, because this is not spatially calibrated tracking, you don't require the patient's consent to track them. Like, you could track somebody without their being aware of it, for example, through the camera in their computer. And, to be able to gain someone's health information just by having a conversation with them on a webcam is a little bit terrifying. So we didn't go in that direction initially. And, it'll be interesting to see what happens when we do. We are very cognizant of this. So I would just say it's incumbent upon the inventors to be responsible, and we shouldn't make the Facebook mistake of, creating a technology that then becomes a monster and has algorithms that are destructive for humanity.
Dr. Rosina?
Yeah, so building on what Uzma said, because obviously I agree with everything that she said. And also, I am extremely excited about the potential for us to improve algorithms for the benefit of patients at a time frame that is unprecedented. And that's why I was, I typed some of those questions to Dr. Bakul Patel, because the regulators can't keep up with the speed at which we could improve an algorithm. And that algorithm should be available to patients if we can help them. And so I'm eager to see where this world goes next.
For sure. And Professor Ahuja?
Yeah, so I teach to a lot of young minds. So here's my perspective on that. The future is here, to borrow Nathan's point of view, and the future is big and the future is bright in my mind. I have no doubt about it. I see a lot of potential, but the key is the two things. One, the way I think about it is healthcare is the fastest growing sector, the second biggest sector of the economy. How do you make an elephant as nimble as a cat, and how does regulation catch up? And so that was the key thing. Those are the one big factor. The other is, as Dominique said, your privacy has to become a core function. And the way I see it is just as government did with the banks: stress test, and stress test. Build it in, cross-validate. There's a lot of technical things out there, but testing it ahead of time before you go from an engineering perspective.
Fantastic. Well, I know we're losing Dr. Rosina, so thank you so much, Dr. Rosina, for being on the panel. We really appreciate
so much. I really enjoyed it. Very nice to meet everybody.
Thank you. So I would encourage folks to go ahead and drop questions in, and we'll just go through them and use a few minutes. We've got one question. It's lengthy, but it's fascinating, and I think, Dominique, you may be in the best position to opine on this one. It's going to the bill you mentioned. I believe you said it was presented by Senator Booker, and the kind of connection between civil rights and the non-discrimination components that need to be baked into algorithm usage. And this questioner, Jennifer, asked, so how confident are the speakers that the approach will be sufficient, given the threats to civil rights. And she specifically mentions a case that's going up before the Supreme Court, which is 303 Creative versus Alenis, that she says pits the First Amendment speech rights against non-discrimination rights. She's asked, do we need to be concerned that these efforts to promote algorithmic fairness will fail? Or I would ask, what are the challenges with the legislative efforts? And I think maybe we've talked about some of them already, but I would, throw that to you.
Yeah, so just for everyone's information, the bill that I was talking about is by Senator Booker, Wyden, Clark, and it's called the Algorithmic Accountability Act of 2022. And so they're going into a bunch of things, but the discrimination issue is there. There's also a number of, let me just talk about both the legislative and then just what's happening in business. So with respect to algorithmic fairness, you guys might be familiar with some decisions by some major corporations to just hold off on selling surveillance technology and facial recognition technology to law enforcement, for example, until some parameters are in place about algorithmic fairness and what is going to be acceptable and how the information is going to be used for surveillance purposes. And that's a voluntary situation where companies were just like, without some law or some, baseline, we don't feel comfortable selling this information. And that's happening in advance of the laws. And then we've got these bills. And if anybody wants to reach out to me separately, I have a whole list. There are about 12 different bills, and both on the federal level and then on the state level, about 29 that have been introduced. Now, will they all get passed this year? Will there be, resistance down the way? Absolutely, I'm sure we'll see that. But what I'm pointing out is that on this issue of discrimination, what's interesting is that there is bipartisan support. So I'm actually working on a piece with the Brookings Institute right now, as well as the R Street Institute, about this very thing, that there are, this is a situation where, in fact, on the Republican side, they have actually come out with more sort of detail on the anti-discrimination issue than the Democrats. So this is an area where there really isn't the sort of, there isn't that, I guess, sort of polarization on each side. So I see in the next 2 to 3 years, something coming down. And of course, in California, we had AB 13, which was withdrawn, that did include algorithmic fairness as part of the terms. And I understand there's talk about it being reintroduced this term. So, it's not a question of if, but when. The way I see it, and this is very similar to what I said about privacy law on the state level before CCPA went into effect. So I just think that it's a matter of time and better for the companies to get ahead of this now, because it is a trend. And it's also a situation, again, on the brand value and trust part. Companies don't want to be out there with an algorithm that, these days with the savviness of the consumer base, you don't want a situation where consumers are able to reverse engineer and see that your algorithm doesn't work in different with different data sets, or isn't predictive of health with certain types of groups. So it's a brand value trust issue, but the legislation, I think, is really around the corner.
Fantastic. With Professor Cortez's permission, we have so many questions. I'm going to get one more out there and ask Dr. Uzma to address this one. It was in the Q&A, and it ties to this issue of race. It's a kind of a more practical question, which is, has there been evidence for or against the role of race in data sets? You mentioned the dermatology example with the skin and the pulse oximeter. Should change, let's see this question, also looking to kind of factor in geographic distribution when it comes to assessing these impacts?
Yeah, so in medicine, it's well known that there are social determinants of health, which include things like what your zip code is, and whether or not your parents are employed, or you're living in the same house as them. if you're a child, for example. And then there are also the sort of genetic determinants of health. And it's a question of, at what point does it become racist or racism when a technology doesn't work as well in some of a population, like a population with a particular characteristic or trait than it does in other populations. And, I think Francis Shen had a question in there where he sort of put the word, normal in parentheses, because when it comes to neuro, we don't know what normal is. We think we're normal, but, that's because this is the reality that we live in. Other people would not consider this normal, sitting on Zoom on a morning. So the definition of normal is a construct that's artificial. And so how do we make technology that embraces not just our definition of normal, but everyone's definition of normal? And that's a huge challenge. I would say that I don't have a solution, but I do know this. I think that it has to be financially incentivized, because what we do know in this country is that technologies that have a financial benefit to someone somewhere are the ones that succeed. And so we have to make it so, when I first invented eye tracking, I wanted to give it away for free. That was my idea, because I wanted to change the way brain injury was diagnosed and defined. And I realized that I couldn't, because then it would never get incorporated into hospital systems. So they have to profit in order for the technology to be incorporated. Similarly, we have to make algorithms where it is profitable to the organizations that use them for them to be equitable. Otherwise, they won't be equitable.
Fantastic. Well, I think we have used up all the time that we can take. It has been my honor to moderate this panel. Thank you, Dr. Uzma, Dominique. Thank you, Professor Ahuja. Really appreciate your insights today. Lots of questions here, so I would encourage people to reach out to the panelists and keep this dialogue going.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam, for moderating.
Thank you, Sam, for that great moderation. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you all. Turning it back over to Professor Cortez.